On the day he left, the sky was painted with the most golden autumn hues I had ever seen, as if the world knew that moment needed to be etched in my memory, with beauty enough to sustain an absence. There was no cry, no drama, just the sound of the wind dragging leaves across the courtyard, and the weight of the glance we exchanged before he mounted his horse. My heart didn't break in that moment. It merely withdrew, like flowers do before winter. I was young, and love was still a living flame within me, something that warmed me from the inside and believed with unshakable faith in the promise. His lips left behind. I'll return before the cycle of seasons is complete. It was simple, as all vows made between those who haven't yet learned what time can do to words are. But I believed. I believed as one breathes. In the first week, I counted the days. In the second, I began writing letters that would never be sent. In the third, I wore the blue cloak he liked, even if no one else noticed. The castle continued its routine, with feasts, meetings, political decisions that didn't interest me. But I lived in my own time, within a silent clock that marked not hours, but longing. When winter finally arrived, bringing frost that petrified even the garden fountains, I continued my vigil. Every morning I went down to the eastern gate, where our eyes had parted, and stayed there until the cold threatened my bones. I never saw a figure approach, but even so, each step back to the castle was accompanied by a whisper within me, "He will come." The people began to talk discreetly. They said the princess was losing her mind, that my gaze was distant, that I spoke to the wind. Maybe it was true, or maybe it was just love transforming into resilience. Because his absence didn't drive me to madness, it led me to waiting. And waiting, I discovered, is a kind of faith that bleeds in silence. Winter settled in like a kingdom of its own within mine, covering not only the rooftops and courtyard stones, but also the feelings I once knew how to name so clearly. The cold didn't come only from outside. It began to live within me, between my ribs, at my fingertips, behind my eyes. I continued my rituals, waking early, watching the gate, lighting a candle for him every night. There was no news, no letters, no messengers, just silence, thick and constant, like the snow that piled unhurriedly on tree branches. Sometimes I wondered if he still remembered me, if he felt the same pang in his chest when the wind touched his face, if he still saw my smile. In his autumn memories, other times my faith wavered and I blamed myself for it, as if betraying a sacred secret. The court spoke of alliance strategies, distant princes, possible unions. I listened to it all as if behind thick glass. None of it pierced me, because he still lived within me, not as a delusion, but as a root, strong, unmoving, persistent. When spring arrived, the world bloomed without asking permission. The trees awakened, the birds returned, and the garden smelled of life again. But in me, winter hadn't yet departed. I tended to the flowers with skilled hands, but without joy. There was a melancholic beauty in watching the world reborn when what you await remains absent. I began writing short texts about what I felt and hid them under the wood of my chest. No one read them, no one knew. It was as if I needed to record somewhere that I still believed, that I still felt. And even on days when doubt gnawed at me most fiercely, when I thought he might have fallen in some battle, forgotten his promise, or even built another life, I returned to the gate, always to the gate, because there was a love I didn't know how to undo. And it lived there, between the last leaf that fell in autumn and the first flower that bloomed without him. That summer, when the days grew long and the fields were covered in green as far as the eye could see, I noticed something within me beginning to change, not as one who gives up, but as one who surrenders to the weight of time. The waiting still existed, but it no longer burned as before. It had settled into me, becoming part of my being, like an old scar that no longer hurts but never fades. The castle servants stopped commenting on my solitude, and the maids learned to respect my silence. Even the court advisors, once insistent on presenting suitors, began to look at me with a mix of pity and resignation. They knew I wasn't a woman to bend for convenience. Some called me stubborn, others a foolish romantic. But there were also those who looked at me with restrained admiration, as if they understood the value of a fidelity that resists oblivion. I began walking alone, through the fields in the early hours, gathering flowers before the heat faded them. I made small bouquets and left them under the tree in the garden where he used to wait for me. It was a silent, almost childish gesture, but it brought me peace. No one joined me on those mornings. They were moments just for me, and perhaps just for us. During one of those walks, I sat in the shade of the palace's oldest fig tree and cried for the first time in a long while. Not a desperate cry, but a calm lament. Full of love and longing, I cried for all he hadn't seen. The seasons that passed without him, the decisions I made alone, the dreams I buried for not being able to share them. And then, in that moment of absolute surrender, I understood something clearly for the first time. If he didn't return, I would survive. But if he did, I would still be here, steadfast, whole, waiting not out of obligation or pride, but because the love I gave was mine, whole, offered consciously and without regret. When autumn returned, and the leaves began to fall again, dancing in the wind, like gentle farewells, I realized a year had passed, a complete cycle, and even without knowing if he still existed in the world, I knew something within me remained alive, because I no longer waited just for him. I waited for myself too, for the woman I had become during this wait. The arrival of the second cycle brought not only a new autumn, but also a new silence within me. A less cutting, denser silence, the kind that doesn't wound but shapes. I was no longer the young girl who looked at the gate with shining eyes and trembling fingers. Now I looked with firmness, as one who understands that waiting is no longer about who leaves, but about who remains. My hair, once long and always loose, was now carefully braided every morning. Not out of vanity, but as a way to remind myself that there was discipline, strength, and dignity in me, even in the absence of certainties. The court persisted with feasts, diplomacy, and alliances, and once again, names of princes and dukes surfaced in side conversations. But I, with a serene smile and an impenetrable gaze, deflected all such attempts with the ease of one who owes no explanations. Some saw me as an enigma, others as a problem. I was neither. I was just a woman who had made a choice, and choices, I learned, are seeds that take time to bloom or not. During the second summer, the pressure became more aggressive. My ladies whispered in the corridors. The king, my father, called me for more direct conversations. "The kingdom needs continuity," he said. I listened in silence, because no worldly justification could shake the intimate certainty that sustained me. When everyone slept, I still walked to the window of my room overlooking the forest and whispered his name, not with anguish, but with tenderness. There were nights when I swore I heard the sound of distant hooves, and my heart raced, only to slow again, defeated by reality. I began to write more. I turned my memories into words, my anxieties into verses. One day I left one of those texts forgotten on the library table. Someone found it, read it, and spread it. Soon, the halls murmured fragments of my words. The Io princess, once a symbol of stubbornness, began to be seen as a symbol of courage. And though I didn't seek applause, there was something comforting in knowing that my waiting was beginning to inspire others. That perhaps my silent love had found a way to exist beyond me, because even if he didn't return, I kept living. And that, just that, was already a form of victory. As autumn deepened and the leaves turned the garden floor into a carpet of ochre and red tones, I felt that waiting ceased to be a gesture directed at someone specific and became part of who I was. I no longer waited just for him. I waited for the answer time had promised me. The tree where I left flowers was losing its leaves, and in its bare branches I saw a mirror of my own emotional nakedness. I had stripped myself of all illusions, urgencies and romantic delusions. What remained was love in its rawest, truest form, the kind that demands no return. And it was in this state of clarity that an old, time-bent woman from the village approached me one day in the garden. She carried a piece of fabric with embroidered verses, mine. She said my writing had given her strength to wait for her son, who had left for the sea years ago. I embraced her, and for the first time, I understood that my suffering, translated into words, had transcended the castle walls. Amid my pain, a new form of royalty emerged, that of touching hearts with my hope. And so, without realizing it, I began to find beauty in what seemed only absence. I returned to painting, walking unhurriedly through the fields, lying on the grass, and watching the clouds with the same enchantment I had as a child. Waiting ceased to be a prison. It became contemplation. The world turned, and I turned with it still anchored in that ancient promise, but no longer weighed by necessity. It was no longer about him returning. It was about what I was building in his absence. When winter arrived again, I realized there was no more pain. Just a faint thread of longing, constant and sweet, like background music you know by heart. My hair now had silver strands at the ends. My hands carried more firmness, and my eyes more depth. I didn't see myself as an abandoned woman or a tragic heroine. I saw myself as a whole woman who had loved truly and waited with dignity. And even if the world never understood that choice, even if he never crossed the kingdom's gates again, I knew I had been faithful to something greater than a promise. I had been faithful to myself. The second winter fell over the kingdom like a curtain of silence, covering even the most ordinary sounds of castle life with thick snow. The flames in the fireplaces crackled as always. The servants went about their tasks, and the bards played songs celebrating the arrival of a new cycle. But to me, everything sounded distant, as if the world was suspended, frozen in a pause. Only I perceived. I walked the corridors with a light veil over my shoulders and eyes that no longer searched for him in the shadows, but in memories. It was a time of acceptance, but not surrender. My heart no longer bled. It simply beat with tranquil constancy, as if it had made peace with absence. In that season, I wrote the final lines of what would become my book, a collection of poems, thoughts, and fragments of hope sewn together by the narrative of a wait. I handed it to the royal librarian with steady hands and asked her to keep it among the most forgotten volumes on the highest shelf. Not to be lost, I said, but to be found at the right time. On a frigid afternoon, I went alone to the forest, dressed only in my thick wool cloak and heavy boots. No guards, no servants, no carriage. I wanted to walk to the clearing where he had kissed me for the last time. The fig tree that sheltered us still stood, imposing, now leafless but not lifeless. I sat under its shade and leaned my head against its rough trunk, feeling time pass through me. I closed my eyes and for the first time cried without sadness. It was a cry of closure, as if washing away not the pain but the attachment. I whispered his name one last time, not to summon him but to set him free. And in that moment I understood. Even if he had left this world, even if he never returned, what we had lived remained alive in me. Not as a wound, but as a reliquary. And then, as one who closes a cycle with reverence, I stood, touched the fig tree's trunk, and promised myself tomorrow I will begin again. Not the waiting, but life. Because I had endured the seasons, and in the process, I became something even rarer than a faithful princess. I became a woman who loved without demanding and knew how to go on, even when time seemed to stand still. This following spring arrived without warning, almost as if it didn't want to startle me. Buds appeared on branches quietly. The winds changed their tone, and the air carried that damp, sweet scent only rebirth days know. But within me, everything remained silently calm. It was no longer spring that made me yearn for return or filled me with questions. It was just time, and I had learned to live it without haste. I began dedicating my mornings to the library and my afternoons to the garden. I planted flowers with ancient names, left letters to myself under stones, and read the poems I wrote as if they belonged to another woman, one who still lived in me but no longer suffered as before. I didn't feel empty. I felt mature. Waiting had polished me like a river shapes a stone. It didn't break me. It reshaped me. And it was when this new piece settled fully, effortlessly, that he returned. There was no royal announcement, no procession, no trumpets. Just heavy steps on the gravel of the entrance, a dust and sun-covered silhouette, a gaze seeking the impossible. I saw him from the tower window, and for a moment, I didn't know if my heart had stopped or finally awakened from a long sleep. I descended the stairs with trembling hands, not as a princess, but as a woman. Crossing the corridor, I noticed the servants' eyes, some surprised, others with tears held back. There was something sacred in that arrival. He was no longer the young knight who left. His face bore marks time doesn't forgive, his back the weariness of one who crossed deserts. But his eyes, oh, his eyes, they were still his, and they sought me with contained urgency, as if needing to be sure it was all real. When we saw each other, we didn't run to one another. We walked with steady steps until the distance between us was overcome. He stopped before me, his breath caught in his throat, his hand extended as if asking permission to touch was more important than the touch itself. And in that moment, with the morning light bathing our faces and the garden's whispers around us, I knew he had waited for me on the other side of the world, as I had waited for him here, through every season. There was a silent beauty in that reunion that no song could narrate. It wasn't a moment of grand gestures or inflamed words. It was something deeper, a communion between two souls who had crossed time, distance, and doubt to meet whole. When I took his hand, I felt the warmth of a world I hadn't known for years. It was a different hand, calloused, heavier, but still his, and mine fit there as before, as if time hadn't dared touch what was essential. We walked together through the gardens where the season's first flowers were already blooming. He told me his story with long pauses, in a low voice and a gaze that carried both weariness and relief. He had been captured shortly after leaving, taken to distant lands as a prisoner, and only years later, with the help of merchants and ancient maps, found a way back. In his cell, he said, he recited my name like a prayer. He learned to track time by the flowers I described in undelivered letters, by the seasons he imagined in the tone of my skin and the sway of my hair. And I, listening to it all, didn't cry. I just listened with an open heart and a calm that surprised me, as if part of me always knew he would return, not as before, but still him. After the walk, I took him to the library. There, I gave him the book I had written, the reliquary of my waiting. He held it like one receiving a sacred relic, leafing through it with reverent fingers, pausing at passages that made his breath falter. "You wrote me when you didn't even know if I'd hear," he said. And I just smiled, because that more than anything, was what defined love: offering without guarantee of return, trusting despite silence, remaining when nothing seems certain. That night, he slept in the castle, in a room beside mine, and I lay down with my eyes open, staring at the carved ceiling, feeling I could finally rest. The waiting was over, but not as a full stop. It ended as a comma, ushering in a new story with two marked, mature, surviving characters. And the most beautiful part was realizing we hadn't waited to pick up where we left off. We waited to meet as new, different, complete, because he didn't return to the same princess, and I didn't receive the same knight. We returned to what we had become, and that made it all sacred. The next dawn, the sky was clear, tinged with a soft light that seemed to announce a new time. We walked together to the fig tree in the garden, the one that held our last farewell and where I left. So many flowers, so many silences. He stopped before the trunk, touched its wrinkled bark with his fingers, and smiled with wet eyes. "You still come here?" he asked, and I nodded lightly. I didn't need to explain that this place had become my temple, my altar of hope. There, more than anywhere, I was whole in his absence. He sat under the tree's shade and called me with a simple gesture. I settled beside him, and for a few minutes we stayed in silence. Not the silence of doubt or pain. It was the silence of those who know without needing to hear, who feel without needing to say. And there, without ceremony, he took a ring from his pocket. It was simple, aged silver, with a small symbol engraved that I recognized, the seal of his house. "I carried it with me all these years," he whispered, "and if you still want it, I'd like it to be yours." I didn't cry. I just extended my hand with firmness, and he placed the ring on my finger as one sealing not a beginning, but the consecration of all that came before. In the days that followed, the kingdom, accustomed to seeing me alone, awoke in celebration. Not for protocol, but for genuine emotion. It was as if everyone's waiting had ended with mine. We didn't have a grand wedding. We gathered only the closest people on a flowery evening, where the bells rang like a breath of renewal. No one there witnessed just the union of two bodies, but the celebration of a faith that withstood time. And at the end of that night, lying with my head against his chest, I heard the heartbeats I had so longed to find again. They were there, rhythmic, steady, real. I caressed his face with my fingers, feeling every mark left by the years, every scar, every absence turned into presence. He kissed my forehead and whispered, "You waited for me through every season." And I replied softly, "Because you were always in all of them." I didn't fall asleep right away. I opened my diary one last time and wrote with a peaceful soul. I waited with my whole heart. I waited as if he would return every day, even when the world told me he wouldn't. And now that he has, I understand that it wasn't the waiting that united us. It was the silent certainty that lives in the hearts of those who know how to love without fear. Because those who love like this love with time, with body, with spirit, and they triumph. The years that followed were serene, like the end of a song that echoes softly even after the final note. We lived without haste, without demands, like those who already understand the value of time and presence. We didn't seek to reclaim lost days or pretend they hadn't existed. Every wrinkle that appeared on his face, every silver strand in my hair, was a silent witness to our journey. And we loved calmly, with the fullness known only to those who have lived the pain of waiting and the miracle of reunion. We didn't take grand trips or nurture lofty dreams. Our days were made of simple rituals: tea at dusk, garden walks, readings under the fig tree, now lusher than ever. Sometimes he reread my poems aloud and looked at me as if I were made of something sacred. Other times, I listened to his road stories, now with gentler eyes because they no longer needed to be told with urgency. Now there was time. When he left again, years later, it wasn't for war or mission, but by the serene will of a body that ceases. I accompanied his final days with the same dignity with which I waited for his return, without despair, with full love. He squeezed my hand one last time and whispered, "Every season, every one of them, was you." And then he was gone. I felt no anger. I felt no emptiness. I felt gratitude, because he returned, because he kept his promise, because our love happened, whole, deep, and real. Today I walk alone through the garden with the slow steps of one who has lived much. The fig tree is still there, immense, a faithful shade to my days, and beside it a small plaque with simple eternal words. Here a princess waited, and love came, when it was time. Sometimes young people from the kingdom ask me for advice about love. I smile, lower my eyes, and say, love isn't measured by the time it takes to arrive, but by the truth with which it remains. Wait, if you must, but don't wait for someone. Wait for what grows in you when you love with courage, because sometimes the greatest victory isn't the return. It's what you become while waiting. And then I close the diary once more, with a whole heart.